What it do, U.S. history students? I hope this finds you doing well. You can tell how far along we are in the remote learning process by what is going on with my hair. I've got the flow curls going on in the background, and then I don't know. At some point, we're gonna have to get to a spot where we're just not able to gel anymore, and it's just gonna go down. Start looking like a early 2000s skater boy. BOI. That's how we do that. Anyway, we got the afternoon coffee. We're going to talk a little bit today to start off this little case study in the Cold War regarding the Korean War and North Korea. So I just pulled a couple headlines from recently. Well, some go a little bit further back, but recently regarding the problem with North Korea. You probably heard about it in the news. Every single president that comes in, they talk about what are you going to do to better relations with North Korea, or at least make it so that North Korea is not as much of a threat as it typically is. So recently, like very recently, with coronavirus going around, they have talked about how Kim Jong-un, the leader, one of the few true totalitarian leaders left in the world, that we talked about kind of before World War II, he's kind of been out of the spotlight, and people aren't sure if he's alive or if he's still in the hospital. He underwent surgery. They don't really know what it was about, and they're worried about his health. So that's a big deal, given his totalitarian nature. This could cause a lot of chaos within North Korea based on who the successor is going to be. And then finally, one of the big concerns is what is North Korea's military capability, especially in terms of nuclear weapons. People are worried about North Korea developing more nuclear weapons and having missile launching capabilities and things like that. So a lot of issues going on in North Korea. I'm also going to be putting in a optional documentary that you can watch if you want to learn more about North Korea and its dictatorial regime. But anyway, also, so we're going to talk. Sorry, I should have scripted this. So we're going to be talking about the Korean War. It's also sometimes called the Forgotten War because it's kind of like sandwiched in between World War II and Vietnam. It's these two wars that were really big turning points in U.S. foreign policy history, and then the Korean War is kind of just hanging out in between, and people don't really think about it or talk about it a lot. So it's sometimes given the nickname the Forgotten War for a variety of other reasons. But we're talking 1950 to 1953, right at the tail end of Harry Truman's second term. Well, his first only his own term, but his term as U.S. president, and moving into Dwight D. Eisenhower's not regime, administration. Sorry, it's not a dictator. But at the end, 1953. So 1950 and 1953. So first off, actually not first off, if you get a chance, I put this, you can just Google this probably because you won't have a hyperlink, but this is Kim Jong-un looking at things on Tumblr. That's right, my friends, Tumblr making a comeback. I'll show you some of my favorite pictures, but what happened is they've done a lot of candid pictures of Kim Jong-un going around North Korea looking at things. And I know I like to say that you shouldn't think of your dictators as like cartoon characters or comic book villains, but in this case, sometimes it does look like that. I'm trying to get out of the way of the window here. I apologize. Um, so here's our big objectives, though. We're trying to think about what is the significance of the Korean War to the broader events or the broader context of the Cold War. So why does it matter within that context of the Cold War going on? Because there's a lot of military engagements and various proxy wars during the Cold War time period. Not all of them are studied. Not all of them are given a name like the blank war. So why is this one significant? And then secondly, because this is going to go to the next activity that you're actually going to be turning in this week, which is the covert overt operations. But our big objective is explain how and why the U.S. used covert, secret, or hidden, which is what covert means, and overt, which means visible, methods to maintain their national interests and their position as global leader during the Cold War. So again, if that terminology is a little fuzzy for you, we're talking about national interests as in during the Cold War, what were the U.S.'s goals? This was something that we outlined previously in last week's lesson about the beginning of the Cold War, and then their position as a global leader. So how did they use these methods with their military and foreign policy to try to maintain their status as being one of the big two superpowers during the Cold War? All right, so those are the things we're trying to be looking at. We'll come back to those at the end. We're talking about what happened, why, how, what the results were, and then why we care about Korea today, which is what I kind of talked about before. Oh, first off, some of the best from Kim Jong-un looking at things. You've got Kim Jong-un looking at a South Korean envoy right there. See, there you go. If you've never seen him before, it's Kim Jong-un South Korean envoy right there. Another one of my favorites, Kim Jong-un, just taking a tour around North Korea, looking at a robotic football kicker. Football is in the European slash Southeast Asian version of football, which we might refer to as soccer. Looking at children, one of my favorites. Sorry, I'll let you take that one in. And finally, just looking at some Korean babies right there. There you go. Good times for everybody right there. Could you imagine that this person is kind of a genocidal dictator just from that picture right there? All right, let's get back to the Korean War. They're over. So before the war, if you aren't familiar, the Korean Peninsula is just southeast of China, right there, on like in the Pacific Ocean. Okay, you have the Yellow Sea on the west and the East Sea, believe it or not, on the east. But for a long time, since like the early 1900s, the Japanese, this was one of the first imperial enterprises of the Japanese when they were expanding outward before World War II. So this is like 1910. We're talking the Japanese had kind of taken over the Korean Peninsula. Now, during World War II, all bets were off because the Japanese were being expelled from all those areas that they had expanded into, and imperialism was supposed to kind of be on the decline. So what happened was the Americans and the Soviets disarmed all the Japanese soldiers in Korea during World War II. And because of the Cold War, they never really reunified. So the Soviets had like control and influence in the north, and the Americans controlled the southern portion of Korea when they're expelling the Japanese. Remember from last week's lesson, China falls to communism, communist government under Mao Zedong. So North really being solidified by communism. So the US is kind of in the South because of the Cold War. They're not willing to leave and see this area fall to communism as well. Remember, this is the time period where we're coming in with containment and thinking about how do we stop communism from spreading. So one of the last things they're going to want to do after World War II is remove themselves from the Korean Peninsula, at least totally. So it was never really reunified. They still kind of were aiding the Southern government and trying to stop it from being unified. A little bit of an oversimplification, as most things are in the freshman survey course, but for in general purposes, that's what's happening. Let's talk a little bit about the differences between the North Korea and South Korea, which are what the countries are today. So South Korea is also known as the Republic of sorry, not the Republic of North Korea. South Korea is also known as the Republic of Korea. It kind of has a Western style democratic constitution, a more Republican form of government. It has a lot of capitalistic qualities to its economy. In fact, it's one of the preeminent growing economies in the world right now. It's highly known, or it's been well praised for how it has controlled the outbreak of COVID-19. Technologically, using a lot of data to try to concentrate and, no pun intended, contain the virus where it was in South Korea. But anyway, so capitalistic economy had a lot of support from the United States and the United Nations as this like Southeastern Asian country that's going to try to kind of be this fortress against communism during the post World War II era. So they wanted to unify Korea through democracy and capitalism, which if you think back again to last week, that's like the national interest or the global interest of the United States at the time, is to try to get as many free market democratic societies as possible. I put in this sort of caveat because Syngman Rhee wasn't the most democratic leader. I mean, there were some authoritarian tendencies that were definitely going on, silencing press, throwing out people that were against him, things like that. But for all intents and purposes, given the alternative, the US saw this as the people that they wanted to support. In North Korea, there he is, my friends. You can kind of maybe see the family resemblance. This is Kim Jong-un's grandfather. This is Kim Il-sung, and he is the leader that comes to power in North Korea. And North Korea had the influence really of three dictators. You had Joseph Stalin from the Soviet Union, was really influencing money and weapons to North Korea. Mao Zedong in China becomes the dictator of of China. The communistic China, influencing North Korea, its neighbor directly to the south. And then North Korea is China's neighbor directly to the south. And Kim Il-sung in North Korea. In fact, when Kim Il-sung takes power, they actually do the calendar to like start at like the beginning of time is when Kim Il-sung takes power. So, I mean, just a totalitarian by all, meaning of the word. So his goal is to create a communist Korea, a single party state that's controlled all economic assets and all aspects of people's lives. So a totalitarian version of communism, very, very similar to what's going on in China and also in the Soviet Union at that time as well. Um, yeah. So again, if you think about the Soviet Union's big, what they're trying to do at this time is they're trying to expand communism. They're trying to make sure they get as many allies in as many different places, especially near them on the Asian continent as possible. So this is right up their alley as well. So in the early war, on June 25th, 1950, under the advice of China and the Soviet Union, well, maybe not the advice, but they got the okay from China and the Soviet Union. The communist North Korea invaded the capitalist South Korea. So you had the initial stages. It's going to be funny how this map really works out. The initial stages, you have this invasion across what's called the 38th parallel right here, which is what divides North Korea and South Korea even today. And the UN, this new uh, global body that's supposed to maintain world peace, is going to get its first big challenge. They're going to be like, all right, well, what are we going to do? We feel like this is a movement of aggression, especially since China and the Soviet Union are kind of influencing this to happen. So what are we going to do? And the US, being all about containment at this time, says, hey, we'll lead the military expedition to try to solve this problem and aid South Korea. So the United Nations troops under American leadership, and that's a big thing, is like they say it was UN. I mean, Americans, I mean, they gave pretty much 80, I think it was like 80% of the troop force. They're really leading the effort here. So it was American-led kind of police action on behalf of the United Nations were sent to Korea to try to solve this problem. So there's some early success in early 19, or not early 1950, but early in the war in 1950. Douglas MacArthur, that's right, my friends, that Douglas MacArthur, famous for the Philippines during World War II, he comes in and they do an amphibious invasion at Incheon, and they're able to just invade the enemy lines and push North Koreans back behind the 38th parallel, nearly to the Yalu River. So we're talking way up here, up to the border of China. So again, if you want keeping track of the scorecard at home, we've got the North Koreans coming in this way. Then you've got the Americans and the South Koreans pushing them all the way back to here. So right up to the Yalu River, right on the border of China, which is a big deal because now you got communist China and you've got American troops that are right on the border. They push the North Koreans all the way back. And there's this debate about, do we want to maintain North Korea? Do we want to break into China as well? And then China's got to decide, do we want to commit to this war now that it's right at our border? So a lot of things happening here, which people are looking at and they're like, this could be like a World War III type of situation, depending on how it breaks down. So in November of 1950, China actually entered the war on behalf of the North Koreans. So they like gave their blessing to North Korea to do this invasion, but now they're a little bit worried about their own sovereignty and their national interests. So they launched a very successful attack across the Yalu River. Douglas MacArthur, the general that was in charge of the US and UN operations, he actually demanded, he asked President Truman to allow him to expand the war into China. So actually go to war against China and try to take over or roll back communism in not only North Korea, but China as well. And Truman said no. And he thought that he wanted to remain committed to a limited war, just accomplish the objectives that were at hand, that they started out with, not get too murky. The other thing we were worried about was really just, are you going to fight and win a war against China? Is it going to bring the Soviet Union in? Even though at this time, like the Soviet, luckily, I think I said this in the last video, luckily for the US, the Soviet Union and China never really were simpatico in terms of like getting along really well. So in November 1950, China enters the war. Truman doesn't want to commit to an extended war into China, and Douglas MacArthur really starts criticizing the president. He was kind of like this like celebrity war hero at the time, and he had this cult of personality that followed him, and people in the media like really like to get a story about him pushing back against Truman and the battles that they had back and forth as well. So in April 1951, Truman did this very controversial move where, after being criticized over and over again, he fired General MacArthur, and he replaced him with this guy named Matthew Ridgway, who's not nearly as well documented in U.S. history. But there's a little inside joke that an old friend of mine have about Matthew Ridgway, which I won't get into now, but if you want to hear it, we can talk about it later. But just for the sake of time, Matthew Ridgway takes over the operations, and Truman remains committed to the limited war. And MacArthur basically like takes this opportunity to go on this big like goodwill mission of like getting people to also criticize Truman and like talk about how he was right and all this stuff. So a little bit of like political infighting that goes on between the military and the president at this time. But limited war. There's some statements about dismissing MacArthur. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on their heckling of each other, but you can check those out in the PDF form if you want. So Chinese and North Korean forces actually were, now that you've got more people coming in, they're successful in pushing the United Nations forces back south of the 38th parallel. So again, that 38th parallel is what divides North and South Korea. So they're able to repel that invasion back across where it started from. So you had this a little bit of this turning of the tide. So the operation, we talked about strategy, operations, and tactics. This was called Operation Strangle. It was 10 months of sustained attacks on really North Korean infrastructure. So like bridges, tunnels, yards where they would marshal troops, other rail routes in North Korea. They also had support of the Army and Marine. If you're big into wartime technology, this was the first major use of helicopters in a war. So yay. And then the communists met UN military negotiators in November 1951 to begin peace negotiations. So remember, this war goes on until about into 1953, but by 1951, they're already kind of seeing it die down to the end, and they're starting to negotiate a peace. So end of the war, once again, we had, just to recap, we've got the initial invasion. Then we've got the UN push them all the way back to China. Then you've got China and the North Koreans coming into the war and then pushing them back south like this. Then you've got the US and the UN and South Korea like pushing back to this kind of stalemate back at the 38th parallel. So in mid-1951, the UN forces pushed the Chinese north of the 38th parallel. There's still some small battles and skirmishes, but they finally signed an armistice in July of 1953. And this is key. It's an armistice, which is a little bit different from a peace treaty. An armistice says we're going to stop fighting. It doesn't mean that the war is completely over and we all agree on how it ends and who gets what. It just means we're going to stop fighting. And to this day, North Korea and South Korea have never actually signed a peace treaty with one another. They just have an armistice, which is why, like, every once in a while, they're a little bit worried about a rocket getting sent over. I want to say in like 2016, early in 2016, there was like this like effort to kind of like create a peace treaty between the two, but I don't believe it ever actually got signed. But there was this like extended effort all the way, we're talking like 60 years later to do this, but they technically are still in like a war state with one another. So the borders were nearly the same as before the war. You had 40,000 American deaths. The U.S. actually instituted another draft for this war. It wasn't an all-volunteer army. 140,000 casualties. It cost $40 billion. The South Koreans lost 61,000. And then communists combined in terms of looking at North Koreans as well as Chinese dead was about 1.5 to 2 million. So it wasn't it wasn't a long war, but it was definitely a war that led to a lot of spent money, blood, casualties on both sides as well. So the armistice, again, the terms were based on provisions that each side would not accept. So like instead of looking at, hey, where can we find common ground? They try to just base it on like, we know you're not going to take this and we know you're not going to take this. So we're just going to try to like find like a way to just stop the fighting as much as we possibly can. So it established a demilitarized zone, which Miss Van Beek went to like physically. So I got some pictures that she provided, but she can definitely give you more information on what it was like to visit the DMZ. I've only seen videos, unfortunately. But the U.S. began a massive buildup of South Korean armed forces, so really helping them beef up their armed forces to stop any future invasions. And there was also a prisoner of war exchange. So one thing they found was a lot of the communist Chinese people that fought and the North Koreans didn't actually want to go back voluntarily. So they almost had to like force them to go back because they wanted to stay in South Korea, where they felt like it was better. So it just kind of gives you an indication of what life under those regimes was like. Here's like the phases of the war. So generally when people study this, they think of it as like 4 phases. So you have like the initial invasion, then you have the pushback to the Yalu River, then you've got kind of this like pushback of the Chinese coming into the war, and then finally you have this like armistice signed right about where the borders were before the war. Okay, so if in terms of like this is your definition of containment, which we'll get to in a second. But hopefully you can see that. The DMZ, the demilitarized zone, the armistice includes the establishment of this zone at the 38th parallel, which is, I think, like, I can't remember the dimensions off the top of my head, but a couple miles, lengthwise. And it still exists today. It's still guarded. There's a really good video where you can see the DMZ. I'll link the documentary again. You can check it out if you want. But just like how the North Koreans on their side of the border, they have to station these three guys, and two of them face each other, and then the other one faces away from North Korea, looking into South Korea, and they're like watching the border, but they're also like they have to watch each other to make sure nobody tries to escape and go into South Korea, or that nobody comes from North Korea to get into South Korea. One thing they do is when they have meetings in the middle, there's on this video, there's like the South Korean troops, like when they're going to go meet the North Koreans and they open the door, they all like hold on to each other because they don't want to be pulled across the border by the North Koreans into North Korea. So there's just this insane stuff that's going on with the border. So the Korean War is usually considered to be a turning point in the Cold War. There's a couple of reasons for that. The first is the U.S. started to shift political and economic pressure more so to military intervention. So they start to see that their limited military interventions can be successful, and they start to rely on that more in those different areas as opposed to like economic and political pressure. Still using what we call those like soft power skills, but being willing to use the military. The U.S. began to focus its efforts on Asia instead of Europe. So this like pivot, as we call it, towards focusing more on stopping the spread of communism in Asia. One huge thing is that because of this focus on Asia, the U.S. starts to help the French, who are currently embroiled in this fight against communists in this little tiny country in French Indochina called Vietnam, which is going to become more important later. Spoiler alert. And then finally, it set a precedence for significant military intervention without a declaration of war. So without a declaration of war, because it opens up the door for the U.S. to be able to use the military without Congress needing to declare war. So Congress has not declared war since World War II. Every military engagement that the U.S. has been involved in has been done because the president sent in troops to a place under like a similar police action like what the Korean War was, and then eventually Congress like kind of like okays it but doesn't actually declare war. So it's a huge change in how the U.S. conducts its military and foreign policy as well. And that goes beyond just the Cold War. Yeah. This is a cool picture from space of the Korean Peninsula today, so you can see what South Korea looks like. Here's Seoul, the capital of South Korea. Here's Pyongyang, the capital of North Korea, and then you can see that much of North Korea lives in darkness without electricity, and you get up into China. So it's an interesting comparison of just how this Korean War and the establishment of these governments has impacted these two countries. This is just for your own little giggles, I guess. Just huge in 2013, my friends. 2012, 2013, the year of Gangnam Style. All right, so oh shoot, I left. I didn't animate it. Are you kidding me? This is terrible. Well, we'll get to those last. So here's the three big objectives. I didn't put this one in the beginning, but the first question was, how did the Korean War represent the Truman Doctrine in action? Why was the Korean War significant within the context of the broader Cold War? So why do we care about that? And then how did the Korean War represent the use of overt and or, depending on what happened, covert methods to maintain U.S. national interest? And I think I defined them on the first slide, but just really quickly, overt means out in the open, using your military. Everybody knows you're there. It's an open military engagement. Open, over, overt, okay? Covert has the word like cover in it, or like more like closed, sort of. Not really. We'll just use cover. That sounds better. Covert means like undercover, secretive. You're going to see more examples of the U.S. not openly becoming involved in other countries, but using more covert methods like the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, in different countries. So I would encourage you to look at the notes you have if you were taking notes on that optional note sheet, or just think about it, or go back if you need to, but try to see if you can pause me and answer those yourself, because that'll show that you kind of understand what's going on here. Okay, and then I'm going to go through them at the end. Let's take a couple sips just to give you some time to pause me. Oh yeah, it's good stuff. Actually, I really miss buying the coffee from other places. It's been rough. So rough. Okay, enough about that. So, first question, how did the Korean War represent the Truman Doctrine in action? Well, first, if you remember the Truman Doctrine from back in the epilogue of the Cold War crises, it offered to give economic and military aid to any nation fighting totalitarian regimes, in this case, communist totalitarian regime, which is kind of what he was dog whistling in the Truman Doctrine speech anyway. But give military aid to a nation fighting communism. It's an example of the Truman Doctrine. It was also commitment to containment. Truman Doctrine was all about containing communism and stopping the spread of communism. So it only kept communism from spreading. It did not roll back communism. In fact, that's what Douglas MacArthur wanted to do. He wanted to go into China, and Truman said no. He was going to be committed to a limited war, committed to containment. So that was an example of how it was the Truman Doctrine as well. Why was it significant in the broader context of the Cold War? Now, you could just go back to the slide and like regurgitate that part, but I was going to try to give some points that maybe I didn't directly say as well. So the first one was to demonstrate the U.S. was willing to take direct military action to stop communism. So actually send in the U.S. military under the guise of like being with the UN, but actually take military action. Focus on containing communism in Asia, so focusing more on Asia, which is going to lead to more U.S. intervention in that area later, especially with Vietnam. And it demonstrated U.S. global leadership in the fight against communism. So the U.S. is like, they provide like 80% of the troops. They were leading the charge with the United Nations, so really demonstrating that they're a global leader, not taking a back seat like after World War I, where they're not even involved in the League of Nations, like they are a leader in the United Nations. And then finally, no declaration of war, which I mentioned earlier, opens the door for more military intervention in the future. So here's our final one, which is going to bleed into the CIA activity that I have for you a little bit later. But what we're talking about here is an overt method. So this was direct, open use of military force. So it's the U.S. using an overt method to contain communism, okay, using their military with the UN as help as well. And then we broke it down into national interests and global leadership. So what I did is I just took each one of those and kind of made it its own little answer, which is what I strongly suggest that you do when you do your CIA dossier activity. So national interests. Their national interest at this time was to stop communism from taking a foothold in Asia. They were looking at Asia as their next area of commitment, especially since China had gone communist. So that's their national interest. They want to promote free market economies and relative, we'll see that when we do the covert operations, relative democracy in other places. So that serves their national interest. And then global leadership. So it demonstrates global leadership because it's really the U.S. versus the Soviet Union in this Cold War. Even though the U.S. was directly involved, the Soviet Union was not directly involved, but kind of was because they were influencing what was happening. China was influencing what was happening. So it just shows that the U.S. and the Soviet Union are these two world powers that are competing with one another after World War II for like domination of the world. And then also the U.S. took on a leadership role in the UN, which I already said. So just breaking down those objectives and looking at how does this event, not necessarily just knowing what happened, because we ended up where we started at for the most part in the Korean War, but thinking about like why it matters in the grand scheme of these things. Also, you don't need to look any further about why this matters to what's happening today with the U.S.'s relationship with North Korea. You can just Google U.S. North Korea in Google, and you'll find tons of articles about things that have happened over the last few years regarding U.S. relationship with North Korea. And if you wonder why they are constantly in conflict with one another, this is the exact reason, because of the Korean War. So with that, I will bid you adieu. You can also find the link to the crash course, so you can do crash course Korean War if you didn't like my explanation. And then in the PDF packet, pictures of Miss Van Beek's wonderful trip and actually being, which is told, and I'm seriously jealous because all I've got to combat that with is one time at 1 a.m. I had my picture taken next to the Panama Canal. We can talk about that later. Anyway, take care of yourselves. Let me know if you have any questions, and that'll be it for the Korean War, and I'll meet back up with you when we talk about what the assignment looks like as an extension of the CIA getting involved in different areas. All right? Peace.